The genius Hollywood destroyed. How Orson Welles' masterpiece became his. Curse May 1st, 1941. Orson Welles stood in the back of the Palace Theater in New York, watching the premiere of Citizen Kane in stunned silence. He was 25 years old, the most celebrated young director in America, and he had just created what would be called the greatest film ever made. The audience was mesmerized, the critics were raving, and Orson should have been the happiest man alive. Instead, he was terrified, because he knew that by making this masterpiece, he had signed his own professional death warrant. And the most powerful man in America was about to make sure he never worked in Hollywood again. This is the Orson Welles story that reveals the dark heart of American power. Not the boy genius who conquered Broadway and radio before he was 23. Not the innovative filmmaker who revolutionized cinema. This is about what happens when artistic genius collides with limitless wealth and vindictive power. This is about how Hollywood destroyed the most talented director of his generation because he dared to tell the truth about the wrong man. Because Citizen Kane wasn't just a movie. It was a devastating portrait of William Randolph Hearst, newspaper mogul who controlled American media and much of American politics. And when Hearst saw himself exposed on screen, he declared war on Orson Welles. It was a war the young genius couldn't possibly win. The destruction of Orson Welles began the moment William Randolph Hearst realized what Citizen Kane really was. Hearst was 78 years old in 1941, one of the most powerful men in America. He owned 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, and 8 radio stations. He could make or destroy politicians, start or stop wars with his headlines. Presidents consulted him before making major decisions. But Hearst was also a man haunted by his own contradictions. He had built a media empire on sensational journalism while pretending to moral superiority. He lived in a fairy tale castle with his mistress while preaching family values. He wielded enormous influence while remaining profoundly insecure about his legacy. When Hearst's spies brought him reports about the plot of Citizen Kane, he was enraged. The film told the story of Charles Foster Kane, a newspaper publisher who gained the world but lost his soul. Every detail, Kane's yellow journalism, his failed political ambitions, his crumbling relationship with his mistress, even his dying word rosebud, referring to a childhood sled, was clearly based on Hearst's own life. "This boy has made me into a monster," Hearst told his lieutenant Arthur Brisbane. "He's turned my life into a carnival sideshow for the entertainment of his Hollywood friends. He must be stopped." What Hearst did next would change Hollywood forever. Hearst's first move was to try to buy every print of Citizen Kane and destroy them. He offered RKO Pictures $805,000, the exact cost of the film's production, to burn the negative and never release the movie. When RKO refused, Hearst unleashed the full power of his media empire. Every Hearst newspaper, magazine, and radio station was forbidden from mentioning the film, its stars, or its director. No Hearst publication could run advertisements for Citizen Kane or review it in any way. But Hearst's campaign went far beyond his own properties. He used his influence with advertisers, theater owners, and other media moguls to create an industry-wide blackout of the film. Major theater chains refused to book it. Radio networks wouldn't air promotional interviews. Even newspapers that weren't owned by Hearst were pressured to ignore the movie. But Hearst's most devastating weapon was personal. Destruction. Hearst ordered his newspapers to investigate every aspect of Orson's life, looking for scandals, communist connections, or personal weaknesses that could be exploited. His reporters were given unlimited budgets and told to dig until they found something. Anything that could be used to destroy the young director's reputation. They found Orson's. brief membership in left-wing political organizations during his college years. They discovered his affairs with married actresses. They even investigated his family background, looking for evidence of foreign influences or radical connections. Most damagingly, Hearst's papers began running stories suggesting that Orson was a communist sympathizer who was using Hollywood to spread anti-American propaganda. In 1941, with World War II raging in America on the verge of entering the conflict, such accusations could destroy a career overnight. The Hollywood establishment, terrified of Hearst's power, quickly abandoned Orson. Studio heads, who had once courted the boy wonder, now refused to take his calls. Actors who had begged to work with him suddenly became unavailable for his projects. Even RKO, the studio that had given Orson unprecedented creative control, began to distance themselves from their former golden boy. Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM and the most powerful man in Hollywood, called a meeting of studio chiefs to discuss the Orson Welles problem. The message was clear. Anyone who worked with Welles would find themselves on Hearst's enemies list. Orson doesn't understand the rules of this town, Mayer told the other executives. He thinks talent gives him the right to attack powerful people. He's about to learn that in Hollywood, power trumps talent every time. But the cruelest blow came from Orson's own colleagues. Herman Mankiewicz, who had co-written Citizen Kane with Orson, publicly claimed sole credit for the screenplay in an attempt to distance himself from the controversy. Actors who had given career-defining performances in the film denied that Orson had directed them effectively. Even some of Orson's closest friends began spreading rumors that he was difficult, unreliable, and impossible to work with. The betrayals cut Orson deeply. "I thought I was making art," he told his friend John Houseman. "I thought I was surrounded by artists. Instead, I was in a nest of cowards who would sell their souls to protect their careers." The immediate impact on Orson's career was devastating. Citizen Kane received 9 Academy Award nominations, but won only one for Best Original Screenplay, which Orson had to share with Mankiewicz. The film lost money at the box office, partly because of the limited release caused by Hearst's pressure campaign. More importantly, Orson found himself unable to get another picture off the ground. Studios were afraid to hire him. Actors were afraid to work with him. Even independent producers were reluctant to risk Hearst's wrath by associating with the young director. Orson's follow-up film, The Magnificent Ambersons, was taken away from him by RKO while he was in South America on a government cultural mission. The studio re-edited the film, cutting 44 minutes and adding a happy ending that completely contradicted Orson's vision. The psychological toll on Orson was even worse than the professional damage. At 26, Orson had gone from being the most celebrated young talent in America to being a pariah in his own industry. The speed and completeness of his fall destroyed his confidence and left him questioning everything he believed about art, success, and human nature. "They didn't just destroy my career," Orson said years later. "They destroyed my faith in the possibility that talent and integrity could survive in America. I learned that no matter how gifted you are, no matter how pure your intentions, there's always someone richer and more powerful who can crush you if you threaten their image." Orson began drinking heavily and gained enormous amounts of weight. The slim, dynamic young man who had conquered Broadway and Hollywood became a bloated, bitter figure who seemed to age a decade in just a few years. But perhaps most tragically, Orson never recovered his ability to work freely in America. For the rest of his career, Orson was forced to finance his films independently, often running out of money before completion. He spent years in European exile, making brilliant but compromised films with inadequate budgets and hostile studio interference. His later masterpieces, Touch of Evil, Chimes at Midnight, F for Fake, were created under such difficult, circumstances that many were never properly released in America. During his lifetime, the irony was that Citizen Kane had made Orson immortal while simultaneously destroying his ability to make more films. As the decades passed and the Hearst empire faded, Citizen Kane was recognized as the masterpiece it had always been. Critics called it the greatest American film ever made. Film schools taught courses devoted entirely to Orson's innovative techniques. The movie that had ruined his career became the foundation of his legend. But recognition came too late to save Orson's career or restore his faith in the system. By the time Hollywood was ready to celebrate him, he was a broken man living in exile, struggling to finance small, personal projects that few Americans would ever see. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951. But his war against Orson continued long after his death. The Hearst Corporation and its allies in Hollywood continued to view Orson as a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted with major studio resources. Even as his reputation as an artist grew, his reputation as a reliable commercial filmmaker remained damaged. Studios would offer Orson directing jobs, but always with conditions that made it impossible for him to work effectively. They would give him inadequate budgets, impossible schedules, and final cut privileges that could be revoked at any time. They wanted to hire the name of Orson Welles, said cinematographer Gary Graver, who worked with Orson on his final films. But they didn't want to deal with his vision or his artistic integrity. They wanted a famous director they could control, not the genius who had created Citizen Kane. The personal cost of his professional exile was enormous. Orson's marriages failed, partly because of the financial strain and emotional damage caused by his career struggles. His relationships with his children were complicated by his frequent absences while searching for financing in Europe. Most painfully, Orson watched younger, less talented directors receive the resources and respect that had been denied to him. He saw his own innovations copied by filmmakers who were celebrated for techniques he had pioneered but been prevented from developing. "I created a new language of cinema," Orson said in one of his final interviews. "But I was exiled before I could speak that language fluently. Other people learned my vocabulary and built careers on my innovations while I was forced to whisper in dark corners." But Orson's story isn't just about artistic genius destroyed by corporate power. It's also about resilience, creativity, and the refusal to compromise, even when compromise would have restored his career. Despite everything, Orson never stopped making films. He never stopped innovating. He never stopped believing that cinema could be art. His later films, made under impossible conditions with tiny budgets, contain some of the most brilliant filmmaking ever captured. Touch of Evil, shot in just 18 days with constant studio interference, is now considered a masterpiece. Chimes at Midnight, his adaptation of Shakespeare's Falstaff stories, is arguably his greatest achievement as both director and actor. Orson Welles died in 1985 at the age of 70, still working on film projects, still trying to secure financing for new ideas. At his memorial service, the speakers included some of the most celebrated directors of the next generation, filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Martin Scorsese, who had learned their craft by studying Orson's innovations. "Orson taught us that movies could be art," Spielberg said, "but he also showed us the price that artists sometimes pay for their vision." He was destroyed by the very industry he had revolutionized, but his influence lived on in every filmmaker who believed that cinema could be more than entertainment. Today, Citizen Kane consistently ranks as the greatest American film ever made, but its greatness makes Orson's story even more tragic. We know what he was capable of achieving when given the resources and freedom to create. We can only imagine what he might have accomplished if he hadn't been blacklisted at the age of 26. Orson Welles proved that individual genius could create immortal art. But he also proved that in America, individual genius is no match for concentrated wealth and power when those forces decide you're a threat. His legacy is complicated but ultimately inspiring. Yes, Orson's career was destroyed by vindictive, powerful men who couldn't tolerate honest artistic expression. Yes, he spent 40 years in professional exile, struggling to finance projects that should have been funded by major studios. Orson also proved that artistic vision can survive any attempt at suppression. Citizen Kane outlived William Randolph Hearst, outlived the studio system that tried to suppress it, and continues to influence filmmakers 80 years after its creation. Perhaps most importantly, Orson Welles showed that some things are worth sacrificing everything for. He could have apologized to Hearst. He could have made commercially safe films that wouldn't threaten powerful interests. He could have played by Hollywood's rules and enjoyed a conventional career making conventional movies. Instead, he chose to tell the truth about power, corruption, and the American dream. He chose to use his genius to create art rather than propaganda. He chose to remain an artist even when it meant living in exile. That choice made him a cautionary tale about the price of artistic integrity. It also made him a hero to everyone who believes that art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Orson Welles proved that even in America, even in Hollywood, even in the face of unlimited power and wealth, an individual artist can create something so truthful and beautiful that it becomes immortal. The men who destroyed his career are forgotten. The empire that crushed him has crumbled. But Citizen Kane endures, and with it, the proof that genius can triumph over power if it's willing to pay the price. What do you think? Does Orson Welles' sacrifice of his career for his artistic vision inspire you? Or does it serve as a warning about the cost of standing up to power? Share your thoughts about the eternal struggle between art and commerce, between truth and comfort. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of Golden Age artists who proved that some principles are worth everything. Because the greatest stories aren't always about success. Sometimes they're about the courage to fail magnificently rather than succeed dishonorably. Orson Welles showed us that immortality isn't about living forever. It's about creating something so true that it can never die.